August 7, 1944. Near Mortain, Normandy. The morning fog clung to the bocage like a funeral shroud. Through the mist, the low rumble of engines echoed across the French countryside, a sound that had once meant certain doom for any Allied soldier who heard it. Inside the cramped hull of Panther No. 401, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Hartmann pressed his eye against the gunner's sight, watching the gray world sharpen into focus. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with gun oil filled his nostrils. Behind him, the loader shifted nervously, arranging the long 75 shells in their ready rack. Through the intercom, their commander's voice crackled with confidence they had all learned to trust. "Frontal armor holds. Nothing the Americans have can touch us." Hartmann believed it. They all did. The Panther had earned that belief through blood and fire across the Eastern Front, where Soviet shells had bounced off its sloped glacis like pebbles against a castle wall. Now, as Operation Luttich, Hitler's desperate counterattack to split the Allied beachhead, rolled forward through the Norman hedgerows, these men carried with them an absolute faith. The mathematics were simple, elegant, undeniable. 80 millimeters of armor angled at 55 degrees created an effective thickness of nearly 140 millimeters. The American 75 Sherman gun could penetrate perhaps 90 millimeters at close range. The equation favored the Panther. It always had. But mathematics, like all certainties in war, are only as reliable as the constants they assume. And on this August morning, one constant was about to change. The Panther tank represented the pinnacle of German armored doctrine, a philosophy forged in the victorious campaigns of 1939 and 1940, tempered in the desperate struggles of the Russian steppe, and refined through bitter experience into a machine that embodied everything the Wehrmacht believed about modern warfare. When the first Panthers rolled off the assembly lines at MAN and Daimler-Benz in late 1942, they carried with them not just thick armor and powerful guns, but the accumulated wisdom of 3 years of total war. The design emerged from trauma. In the summer of 1941, German tank crews had discovered to their horror that Soviet T-34s could shrug off their shells while destroying their Panzer IIIs and IVs with contemptuous ease. The sloped armor of the T-34, combined with its powerful 76 Tomb gun, had transformed the calculation of armored combat. German tankers, who had spent 2 years believing themselves invincible, suddenly found themselves outmatched. The psychological shock was profound. Generaloberst Heinz Guderian himself had written in a classified report, "The T-34 is the finest tank in the world." Coming from the architect of Blitzkrieg, this admission carried the weight of catastrophe. The Panther was Germany's answer. Its sloped glacis plate mimicked the T-34's revolutionary design. Its long-barreled 75 kW K-42 gun could penetrate 138 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters, enough to kill any tank the Soviets possessed. Its Maybach engine, despite being underpowered for the tank's 45-ton weight, could push it to speeds of 46 kilometers per hour on roads. By every measurable standard, it was superior to anything the Americans or British could field in 1944. But the Panther carried more than specifications. It carried expectations. For the men who crewed them, these tanks represented not just technological superiority but ideological validation. The Reich's engineers had studied the enemy, learned from defeat, and produced a weapon that would restore the balance. The Panther's armor became a symbol, tangible proof that German industrial might and technical genius could overcome the crude masses the Allies threw against them. When a Panther crew settled into their positions, with the thick steel wrapped around them and the long gun pointing forward, they felt not just protected but vindicated. Training reinforced this confidence. At the armored schools near Paderborn and Munster, instructors used live-fire demonstrations to show recruits what their armor could withstand. They would position captured Sherman tanks at 800 meters and fire 75 rounds at stationary Panther hulls. The shells would spark off the glacis, leaving nothing but scorch marks. The instructors would smile and say, "This is what the Americans will shoot at you. This is what will happen." The young men would laugh, their fear dissolving into swagger. Lieutenant Werner Verlker, who would command a Panther in France, later recalled those demonstrations. "We watched the American shells bounce away like tennis balls. Our instructor told us the Sherman was a joke, that it took 5 Shermans to kill 1 Panther, and even then only if they attacked from all sides. We believed him because we had seen the proof with our own eyes. We thought the Americans were sending their men to die in tin coffins." This belief, this certainty, shaped every tactical decision Panther crews made in the summer of 1944. When they encountered American armor, they did not maneuver for advantageous positions. They did not seek cover. They drove forward, presenting their frontal armor, confident that geometry and steel would protect them. It was not recklessness. It was faith in engineering, in numbers, in the proven superiority of their machine. But faith, no matter how well-founded in past experience, cannot account for what it does not know. And in the summer of 1944, German intelligence had failed to track a crucial development in American ordnance. While Panther crews trained against the 75 gun, American factories were mounting a new weapon, one that would transform the equation they had learned to trust. The M1A2 76 gun had entered production in January 1944, a response to urgent reports from North Africa and Italy that the standard 75 Sherman gun could not reliably penetrate German armor. The weapon fired a 15-pound armor-piercing shell at 792 meters per second, nearly 100 meters per second faster than the old 75. More critically, it used a new generation of ammunition, the M93 HVAP round, a tungsten-cored hypervelocity penetrator that could punch through 150 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards. The numbers were classified. German intelligence had captured standard 76 ammunition and tested it, concluding it was only marginally more effective than the 75. What they did not know, what they could not know, was that American doctrine held the HVAP rounds in reserve, distributing only a handful per tank for use against the heaviest targets. When German analysts examined knocked-out Shermans and found no HVAP ammunition, they concluded it did not exist in meaningful quantities. They were wrong. By August 1944, Sherman tanks equipped with 76 guns were arriving in Normandy in increasing numbers. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division, positioned directly in the path of Operation Luttich, had received nearly 24 M4A1 76 W Shermans in late July. The crews trained hastily with the new weapon, firing practice rounds into abandoned German bunkers. The extra penetration was immediately apparent, but no one yet knew how it would perform against frontal Panther armor. No one had tested it under combat conditions. The German crews advancing on Mortain that morning in August knew nothing of this. Their intelligence briefings had mentioned new American tanks but dismissed them as marginally improved Shermans with slightly longer guns. The threat assessment remained unchanged. Maintain frontal aspect, close to effective range, destroy the inferior American machines with the superior firepower of the KWK-42. Oberfeldwebel Hartmann's Panther crested a low ridge at 6:47 hours, emerging from the fog bank into the pale sunlight of early morning. Below, in a shallow valley crisscrossed with hedgerows, he could see movement, the distinctive angular shapes of American tanks displacing from their night positions. His commander identified 4 Shermans, hull down behind an earthen berm. Over the radio net, the company commander's voice was calm, almost bored. "Engage targets of opportunity. They cannot hurt us at this range." Hartmann's Panther fired first, the crack of the 75 gun splitting the morning quiet. The shot flew true, striking one Sherman on the turret face. The American tank shuddered but did not brew up. The crew bilayed out through the hatches, scrambling for cover. Good shooting but not a kill. Hartman traversed right, finding another target. What he did not see, what he could not see through the narrow optics of his gunner's sight, was the 5th Sherman, positioned 40 degrees to their left flank, hidden in the deep shadow of a hedgerow. It was an M4A1, 76, W, commanded by Sergeant First Class James T. Hendricks of the 2nd Armored Division's company. F. Hendricks had watched the Panther emerge from the fog with a mixture of fear and calculation. He had been warned about Panthers, told they were nearly invincible from the front, that his best chance was to flank and fire into the thinner side armor. But Hendricks had also been issued something his predecessors had not. 3 HVAP rounds carried in a special ready rack beside his gunner's station. His orders had been explicit. Use HVAP only against heavy armor, Panthers, Tigers, make every shot count. Through his periscope, Hendricks watched the Panther traverse right, exposing a perfect profile. The range was perhaps 800 yards, long for a Sherman but not impossible. He could wait for a cleaner flank shot, try to pierce the side armor with standard AP. But the training came back to him. HVAP was designed for exactly this situation. Frontal armor at medium range. The shot the Germans thought was impossible. He keyed the intercom. Gunner, load HVAP, target Panther 11 o'clock, range 800, fire when ready. The gunner, a lanky kid from Wisconsin named Kowalski, loaded the special round with shaking hands. The tungsten core gleamed dully in the half-light of the turret. He aligned the sight picture, placed the crosshairs just below the Panther's turret ring where the glacis met the hull. His finger tightened on the trigger. The 76 gun roared. Inside Panther 401, Hartman never heard the shot. One moment he was tracking his second target, the next the world exploded in white light and screaming metal. The HVAP round struck the glacis plate 3 inches below the gun mantlet, exactly where the armor transitioned from 80 millimeters to 100 millimeters thickness. At that angle, the tungsten penetrator was moving fast enough to exceed the armor's ballistic limit. It punched through the steel like a nail through pine board, fragmenting on the other side into a storm of metal splinters that ripped through the crew compartment at supersonic velocity. The driver died instantly, the back of his head removed by a piece of spalling the size of a fist. The radio operator lived for perhaps 3 seconds, long enough to feel the white-hot metal fragments shred his lungs. Hartman, shielded partially by the gun breech, felt something punch through his shoulder and chest, driving him back against his seat. Blood filled his mouth. Through the ringing in his ears he could hear screaming, the loader perhaps or the commander, he couldn't tell. Then the secondary explosion came. One of the 75 shells in the ready rack, damaged by shrapnel, detonated. The blast vented upward through the turret hatches and downward into the crew compartment. The screaming stopped. Outside, Sergeant Hendricks watched through his periscope as smoke and flame erupted from the Panther's hatches. He had seen tanks die before, but this was different. This was a Panther, a machine his training manuals had told him was nearly immune to frontal attack. And his first shot had gone through its armor like it wasn't there. Did we just kill a Panther? Kowalski's voice over the intercom was disbelieving. Load another HVAP, Hendricks replied. There's more of them. There were. 3 more Panthers were advancing up the slope, their commanders unaware that the lead tank had just been destroyed by a weapon they had been told was ineffective. The Americans had learned in the early days of Normandy to hide, to use the terrain, to avoid direct engagements with German heavy armor. But now, with the 76 gun and HVAP ammunition, the calculation had changed. Hendricks keyed his radio. All Foxtrots, this is Foxtrot 26. We can kill Panthers frontally with HVAP. Repeat, HVAP will penetrate frontal armor. Engage at will. The next 5 minutes shattered 3 years of accumulated German tactical doctrine. American tankers who had spent weeks learning to avoid frontal engagements with Panthers suddenly discovered they could fight back. The 76 gun, loaded with HVAP, was not just competitive with the Panther. At ranges under 1,000 yards, it was superior. The tungsten penetrator cared nothing for the elaborate geometric calculations that made sloped armor effective against conventional steel shot. It simply went through. Unteroffizier Paul Schraber, commanding another Panther in the assault, later described the confusion. "We saw Hartmann's tank burning and assumed he had been flanked, hit in the side armor. That was the only way to kill a Panther. We continued forward, maintaining frontal aspect toward the American positions. Then Muller's tank exploded. Then Dietrich's, all from frontal hits. It was impossible. The Americans did not have a gun that could do this, but they were doing it." By 7:10 hours, 7 Panthers lay burning in the shallow valley below Mortain. The American tankers were stunned by their own success. For months, they had been told that killing a Panther required maneuvering, flanking, coordinated assaults by multiple tanks. Now they were doing it from static positions at medium range. The technological advantage the Germans had relied upon, the advantage that had shaped their entire approach to armored warfare, had evaporated in 20 minutes of combat. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. German tank crews who had operated for years with the absolute confidence that their frontal armor was invulnerable suddenly found that confidence shattered. Every time they crested a ridge or emerged from cover, they wondered, would the Americans be waiting with those new guns? Would their armor, their protective shell of steel and mathematics, prove as hollow as their faith in it? The transformation was not limited to Mortain. As word of the 76 gun's effectiveness spread through both armies, the entire tactical landscape of the Norman campaign shifted. American tank crews grew bolder, more willing to engage Panthers and Tigers in direct combat. German crews grew more cautious, more hesitant. The hunter-killer relationship that had defined tank warfare in Normandy began to reverse. Lieutenant Colonel Robert B. Mills, operations officer for the 2nd Armored Division, wrote in an after-action report dated August 15, 1944, "The introduction of the 76 gun with HVAP ammunition has fundamentally altered the tactical situation vis-a-vis German heavy armor. Prior to August 7, our standard procedure when encountering Panthers was to fix them in place with one platoon while attempting flanking maneuvers with another. This required time, coordination, and often resulted in significant losses. Since August 7, our doctrine has evolved to emphasize frontal engagement at ranges of 600 yards using HVAP. Panther losses have increased dramatically, while our own casualties have decreased. The psychological effect on both friendly and enemy forces. The psychological effect. That phrase, buried in a routine military report, captured something essential about the nature of armored warfare, something the Germans had understood perfectly well until August 1944. Tank combat is not purely a mechanical exercise in ballistics and metallurgy. It is a psychological contest between crews enclosed in steel boxes, unable to see or hear or smell the world beyond their narrow periscopes and vision blocks. Confidence matters. The belief that your armor will protect you, that your gun can destroy the enemy while his cannot harm you, that belief is itself a weapon, as powerful as tungsten or steel. The Germans had possessed that weapon for 3 years. They had used it to dominate Soviet, British, and American armor across 3 continents. And now, in the hedgerows of Normandy, they had lost it. Hauptmann Friedrich von Westernhagen, a company commander in the 2nd Panzer Division, kept a private journal throughout the campaign. His entry for August 12, 1944, captured the shift. The men no longer trust the Panthers. Yesterday, Oberleutnant Kraus refused a direct order to advance across open ground toward American positions, citing insufficient intelligence on enemy anti-tank capabilities. I could not fault him. I have lost 4 tanks to frontal penetrations in the past week, tanks that should have been immune. The Americans have a new gun, a new ammunition, something our intelligence failed to detect. Every engagement now carries the risk that our armor will prove worthless. The men feel it. They advance more slowly. They hesitate. This hesitation will kill more of us than American shells. Von Westernhagen was right. The cascade effects of lost confidence proved more deadly than the 76mm gun itself. German tank crews who had once pressed forward aggressively now hung back, seeking cover, waiting for supporting infantry. This caution gave American forces time to maneuver, to call in artillery, to coordinate combined arms assaults. Panthers that might have broken through American lines in those crucial first hours of an engagement instead waited for reconnaissance, for clearer intelligence, for certainty that no longer existed. The symbolic object that came to represent this transformation was not German but American, the distinctive brass cartridge case of the 76mm HVAP round. These cases, stamped with 76mm HVAP M93 and dated 1944, began appearing in knocked-out German tanks throughout Normandy. German ordnance officers collected them, measured them, tested them against captured armor plate. The results were sobering. At 1,000 yards, the M93 round could penetrate 157 millimeters of homogeneous armor plate. Against face-hardened armor like that used on the Panther glacis, penetration was reduced but still formidable, approximately 130 millimeters under optimal conditions. These cartridge cases became talismans of a sort, passing through German units as proof of what had changed. Crews would examine them with the fascination usually reserved for captured enemy weapons. They represented not just a new American capability but a fundamental reordering of the battlefield. The war had shifted. The Americans, who had fought the entire Normandy campaign with inferior tanks and inferior tactics, had closed the technology gap. Not through genius or innovation, but through the brute industrial capacity to produce better ammunition in sufficient quantity to change the strategic balance. For the young men who crewed German tanks, men like Klaus Hartmann, who had survived his wounds and been evacuated to a field hospital near Falaise, the brass cases represented something more personal. They represented betrayal, not by their commanders or their country, but by the machines they had trusted. The Panther's armor, which had seemed like a law of nature, as reliable as gravity or mathematics, had proven conditional, effective against one threat, vulnerable to another. The certainty they had built their courage upon had dissolved into probability and chance. Hartmann, recovering in a hospital bed with his chest wrapped in bandages, tried to make sense of what had happened. He had done everything correctly, maintained frontal aspect, chosen good firing positions, engaged at effective range, and still the American shell had come through his armor like it was paper. He could not reconcile the experience with his training, with everything he had been told about the Panther's capabilities. It should not have been possible, he said to the doctor, changing his dressings. The mathematics were clear. The doctor, an older man who had served in the medical corps since 1938, smiled sadly. "Mathematics do not account for what you do not know," he replied, and the Americans knew something we did not. The broader implications of the 76mm gun extended beyond the tactical and into the strategic. German armored doctrine had been built on the principle of technological superiority, the belief that German engineering could produce weapons systems qualitatively superior to anything the Allies could field. This belief had survived the introduction of the T-34, survived the arrival of the Stalin heavy tanks, survived every previous challenge because German engineers had always found a solution. The Panther was that solution, the final evolution of the tank designed to win the war. But the 76 gun revealed a truth that German strategists had avoided confronting. Industrial capacity matters more than engineering brilliance. The Americans did not need to design a better tank than the Panther. They needed only to produce a better gun, mount it on their existing chassis, and manufacture enough of it to equip their formations. By August 1944, American factories were producing 2,000 medium tanks per month. German production, devastated by Allied bombing and raw material shortages, had fallen to approximately 600 tanks per month across all types. Even if German Panthers were individually superior to American Shermans, and after August 7, that superiority was questionable. The numerical advantage the Americans enjoyed was overwhelming. For every Panther Germany produced, America produced more than 3 Shermans. For every 76 HVAP round German crews worried about, American factories produced dozens. The equation had become inescapable. Germany could not win a war of attrition against an enemy with that level of industrial superiority. Some German officers recognized this reality earlier than others. Generalmajor Heinz Gieg, who commanded elements of the 116th Panzer Division during the Falaise Pocket battles, wrote in a post-war memoir, "After the Americans deployed the 76 gun, I knew the war was lost. Not because of that gun specifically, but because of what it represented. The Americans could solve any tactical problem we presented simply by producing more and better equipment. We were fighting a production line, and production lines do not surrender." Gieg's pessimism was well-founded. The combat statistics from late August and September 1944 told a devastating story. German tank losses in France during August totaled approximately 1,300 vehicles, losses that could not be replaced. American losses during the same period totaled nearly 2,000 tanks, but replacement vehicles were arriving at Norman ports faster than the losses accumulated. By September 1, the American armored divisions in France were at higher strength than they had been on June 6, while German panzer divisions had been reduced to hollow shells with a handful of operational tanks. But numbers alone do not capture the human dimension of what happened in the Norman hedgerows. For the young men who crewed Panthers and Tigers, the arrival of the 76 gun meant something more than statistical probabilities or loss rates. It meant the end of certainty. It meant every mission might be the one where American HVAP found your tank's weak spot. It meant the armor you had trusted with your life was no longer reliable. Oberjefreiter Hans Schmidt, a Panther loader who survived the entire Normandy campaign, described the psychological toll in a 1956 interview. "Before the Americans got the new gun, we felt invincible. We would see Shermans and laugh because we knew they could not hurt us. After Morton, after we started seeing Panthers burning from frontal hits, everything changed. We no longer laughed. We no longer felt safe inside the armor. Every morning when we climbed into the tank, we wondered if this would be the day. The Americans called their Shermans Ronsons because they caught fire easily. After August, we had no name for our Panthers. We just hoped they would protect us, and we no longer believed they would." That loss of belief, that corrosion of confidence, proved as destructive as the tungsten penetrators themselves. German tank crews who had once operated with aggressive certainty now approached every engagement with caution bordering on paralysis. They gave ground that should have been held. They declined attacks that might have succeeded. Not because they lacked courage, but because they no longer trusted the fundamental premise their tactics were built upon, that German armor was superior to Allied armor. The Americans understood what had happened. Colonel Sidney R. Heinz, who commanded Combat Command A of the 2nd Armored Division at Mortain, later wrote, "The 76 gun did not just give us a better weapon. It gave us something more valuable. It took away the enemy's confidence." German tankers who had operated with complete disregard for our firepower suddenly became cautious. They stopped acting like they were invincible. That psychological shift may have been worth more than the actual penetration capability of the gun itself. Heinz was describing, though perhaps not in these terms, the collapse of an ideology. The German faith in technological superiority, the belief that German engineering genius would always provide the Reich with superior weapons, had sustained them through 3 years of combat against numerically superior enemies. That faith had allowed them to believe they could win a war against the combined industrial might of the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States. The Panther tank was the physical embodiment of that faith, a machine so well designed and well armored that it seemed to validate everything the Reich claimed about its own superiority. When American HVAP rounds began punching through Panther armor, they were not just defeating a tank. They were defeating an idea. And ideas, once defeated, are harder to revive than broken machinery. The epilogue to this story played out across France in August and September 1944. German armored formations, shattered at Falaise and pursued across the Seine, left behind hundreds of destroyed and abandoned tanks. Among them were dozens of Panthers, penetrated from the front by 76 fire. American ordnance teams examined these wrecks, photographing the entry holes, measuring the angles, documenting the evidence of what the new gun could do. One photograph from this period, archived at the U.S. Army Military History Institute, captures the essence of what had changed. It shows a Panther tank, hull number 211, knocked out near the town of Chambois. The glacis plate has a neat circular hole just below the gun mantlet, the signature of an HVAP penetration. An American soldier stands beside the tank for scale, his hand resting on the armor that had failed to protect its crew. He is smiling, not in triumph but in something closer to relief. For 6 weeks in Normandy, men like him had faced these machines with inadequate weapons and desperate tactics. Now, finally, they had something that worked. The brass cartridge case from the round that killed Panther 211 was never recovered. It lies somewhere in the Norman soil, buried beneath decades of grass and rain and peaceful sunlight. But thousands of other cases made the journey back to American depots, where they were inspected, refurbished, and reloaded for the campaigns in Belgium and Germany. Some of those cases are probably still in circulation, still bearing the stamped markings of August 1944, still carrying the memory of the moment when confidence became vulnerability and certainty became doubt. The men who crewed Panthers carried their own memories forward. Those who survived Normandy and fought through the winter of 1944-1945 did so with a fundamentally different understanding of their machines. They were no longer invincible. They were no longer fighting from a position of technological superiority. They were simply soldiers in steel boxes, hoping their armor would hold for one more battle, one more day, one more hour. Klaus Hartmann, the gunner from Panther 401, recovered from his wounds and returned to service in November 1944. He was assigned to a new Panther and sent to the Eastern Front, where the Soviets were closing in on Germany's borders. He served through the winter and into the spring of 1945, surviving when so many others did not. In the final days of the war, his unit was ordered to defend a crossing of the Elbe River against advancing American forces. Through his gunner's sight on the morning of April 15, 1945, he saw American tanks approaching across an open field. They were Shermans, some with the short 75 gun, some with the longer 76. He could not tell from this distance which was which. It should not have mattered. He was in a Panther. The frontal armor should have made him safe, but he remembered Mortain. He remembered the white light and the screaming metal. He remembered the brass cartridge case they had found afterward, stamped with words he had learned to fear. 76 HVAP M93. His commander gave the order to fire. Hartmann placed his crosshairs on the lead Sherman and squeezed the trigger. The shot flew true, striking the American tank on the turret face. It did not penetrate. The crew belayed out, scrambling for cover. Before Hartman could traverse to another target, he saw the muzzle flash from one of the other Shermans. The round hit his Panther's glacis plate just below the gun mantlet, exactly where the armor transitioned from thick to thicker. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the world exploded in white light. Hartman survived his second penetration, though he lost his left arm below the elbow. The war ended 3 weeks later. In the decades that followed, he never spoke much about his service. When asked, he would say only that he had been a tank gunner, that he had been wounded twice, that he had been lucky to survive. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, he would remember the morning fog in Normandy, the confidence he had felt pressing his eye against the gunner's sight, the absolute certainty that the armor wrapped around him would keep him safe. And he would think about the brass cartridge case, about the American factories that had produced millions of rounds just like it, about the industrial might that could solve any tactical problem simply by producing more and better weapons. He had trusted in mathematics, in steel, in the ideology of German technical superiority. The Americans had trusted in abundance in production, in the simple brutal logic of overwhelming force. In the end, abundance had won. Not because it was more elegant or more just, but because it was more real. The Panther tanks that survived the war, perhaps 20 or 30 of them, scattered across museums and private collections, stand now as monuments to a peculiar moment in history. They are beautiful machines in their way, sleek and deadly and meticulously engineered. They represent the pinnacle of a particular approach to warfare, one that believed excellence and innovation could triumph over mere quantity. But they also represent the limits of that approach. No matter how good the design, no matter how thick the armor or powerful the gun, a tank is only as effective as the industrial system that produces and supplies it. Germany's industrial system, by August 1944, was collapsing under the weight of Allied bombing and raw material shortages. America's industrial system was producing tanks and ammunition faster than they could be destroyed. The brass cartridge case, that simple cylindrical piece of metal stamped with 76 HVAP M93, tells a different story than the elegant lines of the Panther hull. It is not beautiful. It is not innovative. It is simply effective, mass-produced, abundant. It represents the democracy of industrial warfare, where victory belongs not to the most brilliant engineer, but to the nation that can equip the most soldiers with effective weapons. In the end, that was the lesson of Normandy. Not that German tanks were poorly designed or that American tanks were superior, but that industrial capacity matters more than individual technical excellence. The Americans could afford to lose 3 tanks for every Panther they killed, because they were producing 4 new tanks for every one they lost. The Germans could not afford such mathematics. The young men who climbed into Panthers in the summer of 1944 believed in a different kind of mathematics, one where quality trumped quantity, where superior engineering could overcome numerical disadvantage. They had been taught this belief in the armored schools at Paderborn and Munster. They had seen it validated on the Eastern Front and in North Africa. They carried that belief with them into Normandy, and for 6 weeks it sustained them. Then, on a foggy morning in August, American tungsten shattered both the armor and the belief it protected. What followed was not just the defeat of an army, but the collapse of an ideology, the idea that German technical superiority alone could win the war. The brass cartridge cases scattered across the Norman battlefields told a truth that no amount of propaganda could refute. Abundance beats excellence when abundance is sufficient to overwhelm excellence. This truth, uncomfortable as it was for German tankers to accept, became the defining reality of modern industrial warfare. Wars are won not by the nation with the best weapons, but by the nation that can produce enough effective weapons to equip its entire force. The Panther was an excellent tank, But excellence, unsupported by adequate production, is merely an expensive way to lose. The men who learned this lesson paid for it with their lives, their limbs, their futures. They climbed into steel boxes believing those boxes would protect them, and discovered too